Okay, this is United States History and Government Review Book, page 295. European Cooperation. In order to rebuild and strengthen their economies after the war, Western European nations made ever-increasing efforts at economic cooperation. In 1951, the European Coral and Steel Community formed to enable 6 European nations to set prices and regulate the coal and steel industries. By 1957, the scope of economic cooperation had broadened to include efforts to improve transportation and eliminate tariff barriers within Europe. Those same nations signed a treaty in 1957 to form the European Economic Community, the EEC, also known as the Common Market. As economic cooperation continued to broaden, this organization later transformed into the European Union that exists today. The European Union has experienced many changes in recent years. The European Parliament and legislative branch of the EU now has the power to approve or reject the EU's budget. In 1999, 11 member states began using a common currency called the euro. The EU continues to grapple with such key issues as increasing employment opportunities for citizens in all member nations. The EU today has 15 member states and is preparing for the admission of new members from Eastern and Southern Europe. Containment in Asia. During World War II, the United States had been an ally of China and an enemy of Japan. After the war, the United States reversed the political alliances in Asia. With its new constitutional democracy, Japan became an American ally. Meanwhile, a communist takeover in China made the United States increasingly suspicious of and hostile to that nation. Communist victory in China. In the 1930s, China had plunged into civil war. Mao Zedong, leader of the communist forces in China, sought to defeat the nationalist regime of Xiao Kicheng. Forgive my way of pronouncing that. In 1949, the communist forces defeated the nationalists and renamed the now communist-led country the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan. The United States was alarmed by this development because it feared that communism would spread beyond China because the United States had overseen the initial rebuilding of post-war Japan and had helped put a new constitutional democracy in place. It did not want to see communism spread to Japan. Support for Japan was now seen as a way of offsetting communist China's influence in Asia. The Korean War. During World War II, Korea had been occupied by Japan. At the end of the war, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, or line of latitude. The northern zone was under the influence of the Soviet Union, and the southern zone was controlled by the United States. By 1948, the southern zone had elected the anti-communist government headed by Sang-Mang Rhee and was now called the Republic of Korea. In the northern zone, now named the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a communist government ruled. Fighting begins. North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950 in an attempt to unify the country. President Truman responded to this invasion by committing American troops to major involvement in the Korean conflict. MacArthur in command. General Douglas MacArthur, a World War II hero, was sent to command the United States military in Korea. Troops from the United States, along with small numbers of soldiers from the UN member nations, were soon involved in battles as fierce as those in World War II. A particularly devastating loss came at the Yalu River when Chinese forces entered the conflict and pushed UN troops south. By the middle of 1951, the war had reached a stalemate. Fighting continued, but neither side was able to advance successfully. Disagreement over the objectives and military strategies in the Korean War caused a major conflict between President Truman and General MacArthur. Although Truman was a civilian, the Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief of armed forces. When General MacArthur disagreed with Truman publicly about the conduct of the war, the president recalled him to the United States and dismissed him from command. Hostiles end. Although trace talks began in June 1951, no resolution was reached before the American presidential election in 1952. During the campaign, the Republican candidate World War II hero Dwight D. Eisenhower promised that if he was elected president, he would go to Korea to aid in the peace negotiations. Eisenhower won the election and did keep his campaign promise, but a truce or ceasefire was not officially signed until July 27, 1953. The war in Korea lasted for more than 3 years and cost more than $15 billion, approximately 34,000 American lives, and 1 million Koreans and Chinese died in the conflict. At the end of the Korean War, Korea remained a divided nation and continued in that political situation until the 21st century. New directions. The policy of containment took a different course with American involvement in the Korean conflict. Early containment effort focused primarily on economic and aid programs. With the Korean War, the United States now showed its willingness to undertake military action to contain communism if it was necessary. American experiences in Korea were a warning of future global confrontations between democratic and communist opponents. The war at home. Even the United States defended democratic freedoms worldwide. Sometimes those same freedoms were in danger at home. The spreading of communism to China had the apparent growing strength of the Soviet Union led some Americans to fear that communism would spread in the United States. This fear led some Americans to take actions that violated the civil rights of others. Many Americans charged the communist agents were trying to subvert or destroy the American political system. Other Americans responded that the actions of anti-communists were more subversive of American value and more dangerous to the nation. Looking for communists. The fear of communism in the United States had its roots in the period before World War II. Anti-communist activity began in the 1930s. HUA in 1938, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, was formed as a temporary investigative unit to look into communist activities in the United States. HUAC operated for more than 30 years. Its well-publicized probe of the movie industry in the 1940s and 1950s led to the blacklisting or cutting off from employment of many actors, writers, and directors. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, often aided HUAC, FBI. Investigations. Critics argued that Hoover conducted anti-communist activities that often violated the civil rights of Americans. The Smith Act. In 1940, Congress passed the Smith Act, which made it illegal for anyone to advocate overthrowing any government in the United States by force or to affiliate with groups that called for such action. In 1951, landmark case of Dennis v. United States, the Supreme Court upheld the American Act. Eugene Dennis, General Secretary of the Communist Party in the United States, and 10 others were convicted of advocating the violent overthrow of the government. 2 Supreme Court decisions in 1957 weakened the intent of the Smith Act and the Watkins v. United States. The court ruled that the HUAC could not punish witnesses who refused to cooperate with its investigations. In Yates v. United States, the court ruled that the Smith Act applied only to those who teach or advocate direct action to overthrow government, not to those who merely advocate it in principle. The Loyalty Program. In 1947, President Truman fueled anti-communist feelings by ordering a loyalty review board to conduct security checks on thousands of government employees. Those whose loyalty was considered doubtful were dismissed. In the early 1950s, Robert Oppenheimer, who had led this research to develop the atomic bomb, voiced his opposition to building the new, more destructive hydrogen bomb. This action and his past association with others whose loyalty was being questioned led to the government hearing about his own loyalty. He was determined to be a loyal citizen, but his security clearance was removed, and he was barred from future government research. The Hiss case. The Alger Hiss case led many Americans to believe that there was a reason to fear that there were communists in the government. In 1948, Alger Hiss, a former advisor to President Roosevelt, was charged with having been a communist spy during the 1930s. Whittaker Chambers, a former Communist Party member, made these charges, which Hiss denied. A congressional committee investigated them. A young Republican committee member from California, Richard Nixon, believed that Hiss was guilty. Nixon's pursuit of these case and Hiss's eventual conviction on perjury charges made Nixon a national figure. The conviction also added weight to Republican charges that Roosevelt and Truman had not been alert enough to the changes of communism. McCarthyism. Against this political background, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began his own hunt for communism. In 1950, McCarthy charged he had a list of State Department employees known to be communists. Over the next 4 years, McCarthy went on to charge that many other people in the government agencies had been corrupted by communism. He used the term infiltrated to describe how the people he accused had secretly obtained government positions. McCarthy made bold accusations without any evidence. This tactic became known as McCarthyism. He ruined the reputation of many people he carelessly accused of being communist. Meanwhile, the Rosenberg case and congressional legislation helped win public support for McCarthy's actions. The Rosenberg case in 1950, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel were charged with giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union during World War II. After a highly controversial trial, they were convicted of espionage. The Rosenbergs were sentenced to death and Sobel to prison. The Rosenbergs were executed in 1953. Congressional legislation. In the same year, the Rosenbergs were arrested. Congress passed the McCarran Internal Security Act. The law aimed at limiting the actions of anyone the government considered a threat to the United States security. The McCarran-Walter Act in 1952 restricted the immigration of persons from communist-dominated nations in Asia and Southern and Central Europe. President Truman vetoed the bill, but Congress passed it over his veto. McCarthy's fall. In 1954, McCarthy charged that even the army was full of communists. He held televised investigations into these charges. For the first time, millions of Americans saw McCarthy's bullying tactics for themselves. His public support quickly faded, and in December 1954, the Senate censored or denounced him for the conduct unbecoming a member. The fall of McCarthy ended the Red Scare in the 1950s. Although anti-communist attitudes lingered as the Cold War continued to drag on, during this time, the tactics of Senator McCarthy were criticized because he violated important constitutional liberties. The term McCarthyism has come to mean the use of methods of investigation and accusations that are regarded as unfair in order to suppress opposition. All right, that's the first part of the reading. I'm going to have this posted on YouTube and Schoology. The reading will continue, but I'll break it up and you'll hear it as I go.